Today is May the 20th, 2009. My name is Kara Newrohr. I'm a librarian at Oklahoma State University Library in Stillwater. And I'm here at the Oklahoma State University Edmund Lowe Library in the Angie DeBow room of the Special Collections and University Archives. And I'm here today to conduct an interview with Dorothy Alexander. Thank you, Dorothy, for coming to Stillwater today for the interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate you driving over. The title of this oral history project is Remembering Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel, Poet and Oklahoma Dust Bowl Immigrant. Could you please tell me a little bit about yourself as we start the interview here? Are you from Oklahoma originally?
I am indeed. I am second generation, born Okie. I was born and reared in western Oklahoma, Roger Mills County specifically. My great-grandparents came from Missouri, along with my grandfather was a teenager at the time, and he met my grandmother after he came to Oklahoma. And they were married and moved to western Oklahoma in the late 1890s, around 1900, I think. And my father was born there, and I was born there. And my family's lived there ever since, and that's where I still live, in Roger Mills County, in western Oklahoma. I am a retired attorney and judge, and I now have a small, very small, micro press where I publish mostly poetry for Oklahomans.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, how did you first learn about Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel?
I had never seen her work before that I recall until Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz published her book called Red Dirt Growing Up Okie. And I purchased a copy of it and began reading it and looking through it, and I saw the fragments of Wilma Elizabeth's poetry in there, and it just blew me away. I just couldn't believe my eyes. It struck me very deeply, and so I was frantic then to find out more about this poet, who she was, where she came from, and what she was about, and mostly to find more of her work. I just simply couldn't get enough of it. And I was just beginning to let people see my own work and thinking about perhaps exposing it to the light of day. And I wasn't sure what I was writing was poetry until I saw her work. And I knew then that I had a great life ahead of me.
What year was that about?
It would have been about 1998, about 10 or 11 years ago, because it was immediately after the book came out. And I think I read my first poem publicly that I had written in about 99, so about 10 years ago that I actually let my darlings go out into the world.
If you don't mind my asking, what decade of your life were you in when you did that?
Well, let's see. I am 75 now. I was born in 1934. I'm a bit younger than Wilma, but I was in my 60s at that point.
Do you see a parallel with that and with Wilma's own story?
Well, I like to think that there is something, because we have somewhat the same background. The rural Oklahoma, borderline poverty, dirt farmer kind of thing. I really relate to her. When I found out her background, it just heightened my hunger for her work and my admiration for what she was doing.
Which poem in Roxanne's book that you pointed out to me earlier was the one that really struck you, I guess?
Of course, I hung on to every word I could find in there. I just searched. Once I saw the first one, I just went through the book pell-mell looking for it. And the one that really blew me away was the part of the fragment from First Visit to Weed Patch. And it goes like this. I went there and walked on the years ever so carefully, as if on broken glass. Yet my feet bled through my shoes, seeping from my heart, and my hands blistered from imaginary hose thrust into them from the rawness of the past. And there was no mistake. I felt hunger. It started from a sign that read no credit and increased the length of Weed Patch Highway. And this spoke to me so eloquently. I can remember as a little girl thinking that there's got to be something better than this. And I saw my mother and my father work until they were just exhausted. And I thought, when I grow up, I'm going to try to do something about this. And I remember the hose. I remember the blisters on the hands because I did hoe cotton when I was a child. My father was raised, among other things, he raised cotton. So it really, really spoke to me. Mm-hmm. And I was hooked, irrevocably hooked.
So after you read this book, your journey as far as learning more about Wilma, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, the first thing I did was try to write like she did. I thought, I think I can do that, and I think it's a little bit of what I've been doing. So my first effort, and it pleased me greatly that I thought I had gotten it. And let me see if I can find the first poem I wrote that I thought was on the order of her work. It was called A Hard Row. We hoed cotton in the heat of summer. Come late fall, we picked it. We pulled ribbons of canvas as we threaded our way between the rows like inchworms on a leaf. I dragged a 10-foot sack until the strap creased my shoulder, a finger width deep. It stayed there 20 years before town living and paperwork erased the weight of all that cotton. And after that, there was an elderly woman who lived in our town who would have been even older than Wilma. And she had been reared in the county, and though she was married to the banker in our town, she had come from very humble origins. And I showed her the work. I showed her Wilma Elizabeth's poem out of Roxanne's book, and I showed her my poem, and I said, "What do you think?" And she said, "Girl, you've got it. I think you've got it." And so I said, "Have you ever heard of this woman before?" And she said, "Actually, I have." And she produced for me a little pamphlet with some of Wilma's poems on it. And she said, "You get on that internet because I know you how to do it, and you find us some more Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel poems and you bring them to me." So that's what I did. And so we formed, her name was Lorena Mayle. She's passed on now, but she died at 98. So we were a 2-woman fan club of Wilma Elizabeth's in western Oklahoma. So we endeavored to find out everything we could about her.
That's great. Did you ever talk to Wilma?
I talked to Wilma only twice, and that was on the telephone. And some years after I first discovered her, in fact, in about 2002, 2003, somewhere in there, I decided that I would try to publish poems, and principally my work, because I didn't want to go through the agony of trying to find somebody that would publish this kind of work, because I was in a hurry. I didn't have as much time as some younger people have. So I figured out how to publish little chapbooks like this one. And I then decided that, and it was very successful. I've probably sold 1,000 copies of this little book.
And that one is called?
The Dust Bowl Revisited. And it's all about Dust Bowl and the people that went to California and the ones that stayed home. And so then I decided to try to publish local people's work, because my friend Lorena, the one that knew about Wilma Elizabeth, she wrote poetry and stories. And so I started a little journal, a little literary book, periodical called Broomweed Journal, subtitled A Literary Voice for the Rest of Us. And I said, after the first issue, I said to her, I would like to have Wilma Elizabeth, some of her poetry in here. but I don't know that can happen. But I set about deliberately to find her, to court her, and to acquire some of her work for my magazine. And I was finally able to do that in, I guess it was 2004, 5. In 2005. I reached her through some friends in Colorado, a poet whose real name I don't know. He's an artist, but he goes by the name of Spiel. And I met him at a poetry reading in Great Bend, Kansas in 2003, and found that he was a friend of hers and a great admirer, because when I went to the reading, a featured poet hadn't shown up, and so they asked me if Michael Hathaway, editor of the Carolyn Review, said, would you fill in as a featured reader? And I said, boy, would I. And so I came out with my Wilma Elizabeth type stuff, and I read from my book. And this man stood up in the crowd and said, hey, that's the way to go. If you want to learn to write poetry, you go with Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel. And so I spoke with him afterwards, and he had her phone number and her address. And it took about a year before she would agree to talk to me or to send me anything. She was very cautious.
So you sent her some letters?
I sent her letters, but I sent them through him because at first he wouldn't even give me her address because he said he had to get her permission. Mm-hmm. And so I think I knew her address. I had found it on the internet, but I didn't presume to write her directly at that point because I was afraid it might spook her, mm-hmm. so to speak. And so I allowed it to go through channels because I did not want to offend her in any way or to alienate her. Mm-hmm. And so he talked with her, and he sent her some of my poems. He wrote her, and then finally it was agreed that I could mail her something direct. So I mailed her my book, and I mailed her one of the Broomweek journals. And I wrote her a letter about my own personal feelings about her work, trying not to be, too effusive, because she was suspicious of excessive flattery. So it was a lesson in diplomacy and tact. Mm-hmm. It was an exercise in diplomacy and tact to get her. And finally, this fellow who went by the name of Spiel. His poetry books are published under that name, S-P-I-E-L. And finally he said, I'm going to give you her phone number because she's going to send you something, but she wants to know more about how it's going to be used and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So I called her, and the first time I talked to her, she said she was too busy to talk with me and that I should call back. But she wouldn't say when. And so I tried several times before I was ever actually able to speak to her at any length, and answer her questions.
So what was that conversation like?
I told her who I was, and reminded her of the letters and my connections with Spiel and with Michael Hathaway in Kansas, and that seemed to allay her fears somewhat. And she did say to me that she'd never heard Michael mention my name. And I said, well, I'm sure he wouldn't unless there was some call. If she cared to ask him, mm-hmm. He would vouch for me. And that I certainly had no objections to her saying something to him. So she finally softened mm-hmm. somewhat, and she did send me poems, and she sent me handwritten poems and asked that I not keep the originals, that I pass those on to Michael Hathaway when I finished with them, to give them to him. And so I did as she asked. And I published her poems, and I sent her a copy of the book. And she actually called me after she received the book, like 2 or 3 weeks, mm-hmm. When I'd about given up on hearing from her. Mm-hmm. She did call me and say that she approved of the the little magazine was acceptable to her, and she thought it was nice that we out in the wilds of Oklahoma were at last getting literate.
Did she say it like that?
Well,
Kind of.
yeah, kind of. Yeah, it's like, well, I'm surprised. I'm a little surprised, like, oh, it was really good, But, I took that all with a grain of salt. I think it was William Butler Yeats, the famous Irish poet, who said when someone criticized him about his personal habits, and he said, well, you can't expect us to perfect our art and our lives.
Oh.
So when someone tells me, well, that poet, his poetry may be good or her poetry may be good, but she acts like an ass, I always just say, well, you can't expect them to perfect their art and their life. So, and hope that people will view me the same way.
Mm. Did you talk to her anymore after that?
I talked to her briefly, but she wasn't feeling well. Her health started going downhill shortly after that, and so I didn't bother her anymore because the last time I talked to her, it seemed to annoy her. She was very tired, and she sounded ill, and so I told her at that point, and I think I wrote her after that and said, I know you're not feeling well, and I won't bother you anymore until I hear from you, and I'll just inquire about your health through our mutual friends. And she said, well, that I prefer that at this point. Mm-hmm. And so I respected her request and her need for privacy and to be left alone because she obviously was quite ill. Mm. And so I just talked to Spiel mostly because he seemed to be in contact with her a lot, or with friends of hers. I think they had some other mutual friends that lived in California.
So you would have been in touch with her then, about the last 4 or 5 years of her life.
Yes.
And she passed away in 2007. Do you remember how you heard about her passing?
Spiel called me immediately when he heard. Mm-hmm. Someone called him, and it was the same day. Mm-hmm. And he called me and he said, Wilma Elizabeth has passed. And so that was that. Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of other people that she corresponded with?
No, other than the correspondence that we have talked about mm-hmm. with Father Philip, the priest, and I think he must have passed on by now, over at Shawnee at St. Gregory's. Mm-hmm. But those are the only people I know of, other than Michael Hathaway, and perhaps a couple of other poets that I met in Kansas. For some reason, she had a kind of a network of poet friends, mm-hmm. and so I felt like I kept up pretty well with what was happening with her through them without having personal contact, because she was not in a frame of mind to make new friends in a distant place, and I respected her wishes regarding that.
Mm-hmm. If you remember, the person that connected me with you was Alvin
yes.
Turner, and I think that he told me that the collection that you have from Father Philip, that there was a story about that, and that he's tied to with you. So could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, Alvin is a good friend of mine and a fellow poet. We read together back several years ago when he came to Western Oklahoma, about the time I published this little book, or maybe even a little before. There's a little museum out in Roger Mills County called the Metcalf Museum, and it's honoring a pioneer woman named Augusta Metcalf, who was known colloquially as the Grandma Moses of the Plains, or the sagebrush artist. And her son, Howard Metcalf, who passed on about 10 years ago or so, built a museum to house her art and their collection of folk items that the family amassed. And when this museum was put together, and it's a very fine little museum. It's very small, but it's state of the art. It's climate controlled, and it's very, very nice. And it's out in the countryside on the banks of the Washita River, where the Metcalf original homestead was. And Al Turner brought his students from East Central University out to help them accession all the artwork as a summer project, his students. And they came, and I met Al at the time. Mm-hmm. And I told him I don't think we mentioned Wilma Elizabeth because I didn't know that he knew anything about her at that point. And then when I did put together my little collection, and he looked at it and he saw Wilma Elizabeth on there, and he said, "Oh my goodness!" And so we realized then that we had a common bond, and so we started doing poetry readings. We read at the old Ritz Theater in Oklahoma City. We read at the celebrations in Cheyenne at the old Rook Theater. Some years ago, I purchased an old Art Deco 1930s movie film cinema in Cheyenne that was kind of going to rack and ruin, and restored it. And so we have poetry readings and musicals and little plays and things there. And we used to have rather elaborate Poetry Month events there, and Al kept coming back, so we're very close. Now I've published a book of poetry for him, and then he was able to acquire some of Wilma Elizabeth's publications and correspondence with the mysterious Father Philip, and I think he bought those at an estate sale, garage sale, something of that nature, and called me immediately and said, "I have these things, and I'm thinking about letting you have them." He was kind of teasing me, mm-hmm. And I said to him, "Well, if you will let me have them, I'll give you one hell of a deal on publishing your poetry." And so, anyway, that's how it. But he did give them to me because he knew of my great affection and admiration for Wilma Elizabeth and her work. So he did give me all the little the books, and there's little scraps of correspondence and personal notes, and all of it seems to give us some modicum of insight into how her mind worked, and some of her attitudes and her values and so forth.
Yes, I agree.
One particular one, and I had, in all the years when she was still alive, I had in the back of my mind someplace that the possibility of bringing her back to Oklahoma, of her coming to Oklahoma, and somehow telling people about her and letting people know, because I thought it was a terrible loss for the people of Oklahoma that they didn't know that someone was out there extolling the virtues of Dust Bowl Okies. And I wondered if she ever thought about that. And I see here in some correspondence with Father Philip dated March 10th, 1979, she says in part, "I'd be very pleased to have more of my fellow Oklahomans reading poems and stories which are largely about them." A gift, of course. So she did really want people back here to know, and I've always thought that it was too bad because I've never found one of her books in a bookstore in Oklahoma. Of course, I've mostly looked in Tulsa and Oklahoma City and some of the larger cities, but I was never able to find one of her books being sold. And so in my little bookstore, I have a little bookstore out in Cheyenne, so I always had a sign up that said, "Exclusives." We have exclusive sales of Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel's poetry. So I also, at one summer, I used to go almost every summer to the University of Iowa to their their summer writing workshops. And I ran across a fellow there named Doug Getch, a poet who was from New York City, and he was there for just to teach the summer workshops. And I noticed that his poetry, he had a couple of books published by Hanging Loose Press in Brooklyn. And so I asked him, he was a little bit dismissive of my poetry, as being a little too mundane for the academic world. And so I mentioned to him I asked him about Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel. I said, I see that your publisher also publishes Wilma Elizabeth, and I like to think that my poetry is not too far from hers. And he said to me rather disdainfully, yes, they're crazy mad for her there. Yeah. They all like her very much, like, I don't share that interest, but at any rate, she wasn't unknown in all parts of the world, just in Oklahoma.
Well, we're changing that.
Yes, I'm very, very, very excited about that changing.
What can you say about her personality, her mannerisms, and if you need to stop and get a drink at any time, feel free.
Okay, thank you.
We'll try to.
I'll say this about Wilma. I have known, of course, with my background, I have known many, many country people, women in particular, who were not. The culture does not encourage women to call attention to themselves. That is part of the culture, is that you maintain your quiet, out of the way position, and you let the men folk do the talking, and that you don't make a spectacle, as my grandmother would say, a spectacle of yourself. I used to think she was talking about my glasses, but she seemed to have some of that, and there was a reticence about pushing herself or her work forward because her papa might not have approved of it, or the general culture, because she was still living, it seemed to me, in the 1930s mindset. There was still that mindset where you maintained a virtuous. If you were a woman, you maintained that appearance of modesty, above all else, modesty, so that you didn't push yourself forward. You weren't brash. You didn't step out and say, look what I've done. Mm-hmm. Look here, did I do something good or what? So she still had a lot of that, even though she had a great talent. I just, her talent was enormous. She had such insight, and but it was at war with her upbringing and her values that had been instilled in her. Because I can tell you, I know people in rural Oklahoma that still talk the same way she did. Because I have heard the conversations that she writes about in her books, in her poetry, and her stories. I have heard those conversations myself among country people.
Such as, what would be an example of that?
Oh, talking about what so-and-so did in Tulsa, and waitresses that were brash. If you notice in some of her poetry, she always has something about waitresses. And there was one named Ruby in one of the poems, and said, were you named after the Ruby Mountains? And the waitress raucously says, no, the Ruby Mountains were named after me. I mean, it was... So there's a fascination with that, and a certain amount of admiration, but that's for other people, not for you. And my grandmother used to say that. My grandmother would say, you don't do this, you don't do that. We're not that kind of people. Our people don't do that. And I would say, but so-and-so at school did that. And she'll say, well, that's so-and-so's business. That's not ours. That is not our way. That's fine, but it's not our way. And I can just hear Wilma Elizabeth's mother saying that. Mm-hmm. Well, that's fine, but that's not our way.
Mm-hmm. What do you know about the area that she came from in Oklahoma?
I haven't spent a lot of time on in that quadrant of Oklahoma, but I don't think it's that much different than southeastern Oklahoma, southwestern Oklahoma, northwestern Oklahoma. The main difference is whether there's trees or not. Mm-hmm. That's trees and water, and they do have more trees and water in eastern Oklahoma than they do in the west. But But other than that, the values, the mores, are all pretty similar. And obviously, if you live in the country, you live in the country.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned earlier in our conversation about your education and how many years you went to school and the different degrees that you have. Would you care to talk about that a little? Or?
Well, yes. What can I say about that? I was the first person in my family, either my mother's family or my father's family, to graduate from college, and that was caused a little bit of conflict in the family. By conflict, I mean conflicted feelings. Not that we fought about it or anything, but my father it caused great conflict in him because he was a kind of that old school where women should be quiet and sit back and let the men folk do the talking. But on the other hand, I was also the oldest child, and I was the oldest grandchild of my grandmother's. My grandmother had 5 sons, and although my father was one of the younger sons, he married and had children first, so I was the oldest grandchild, and I did step out of the mold somewhat, and he was torn between admiring me for it and bragging about it, and in making excuses because I wasn't doing that. But I was determined. I was very determined to get out of that, and but I did concede to him. He would say, if you're going to do that, if you're going to go out in the world, you must amount to something. And so I pursued what I thought was the route to amounting to something. And I became an attorney. My sister, just younger than me, she became an accountant, a CPA. And we laugh about it even now, and we're both in our 70s, but we laugh about how my dad would be very stern with us about it and say, don't think you're special because you did that, and then just walk over to a group of neighbors and say, aren't my daughters special, in effect. So it was paradoxical to say the least. But yes, I am proud to say that my siblings did follow me, and so that we're all, fairly well educated at this point. But a great curiosity. Well, I think my parents, if anything, and my grandparents, whether they expected that outcome or not, they did instill a great sense of curiosity, which led to seeking more and more education. That may not have been what they intended, but that was the upshot of the whole thing.
What do you think about Wilma's educational opportunities, or how she felt about education?
I think that she didn't have the opportunity as a young woman, and that she felt somewhat, she felt a lack there that she was defensive about. It shows up in some of her remarks, in the interviews, and in some of her poetry. She speaks with some disdain about academics, but she also, in one of her poems, she says, they characterize me, or words to this effect, they characterize me as being a poet, although I have absolutely no education, that I'm practically illiterate, and they have no idea how many books I read. Words to that effect. I'd have to look through the things to find the poem. But she does say in so many words, I'm not uneducated. Mm-hmm. I may not have formal training, but I am not an uneducated person, despite what the uppity academics are saying or people are saying about me. So I think she was defensive about her lack of formal education, but she was absolutely correct. She did have an education. Okay. She was highly educated. Mm-hmm. So,
do you know who or what might have influenced her in her writing?
She says in something of hers that I read early on, that the first poem she ever read was one by Sarah Teasdale. And when she was a little girl, she found it, I think, she said in a school book, and she was blown away by it. I don't recall the poem at the moment. When I read that, I immediately ran and looked up that poem, and it didn't do anything for me, but it did for her. So she intimated in this, in the remarks that I read, that that's what set her on a path to trying to make poems out of her words. It was a Sarah Teasdale poem, and Sarah Teasdale, I think, in those days was a very popular poet, especially among women.
I think I've read too. There's a Sandpiper poem.
That might have been the one.
I'm thinking it was Cecilia. I should know this, but Cecilia, somebody.
Oh, I don't
I've
remember.
read a reference that was an influential poem when she was a child too. And I think she said children had to memorize it. It was a poem that was commonly memorized.
Yeah.
In school.
Yes.
But it had a very regular rhyme and meter to it. And I think that that had an influence on her, and she wasn't sure if she was a poet or not.
Right.
Because of that. I'd have to look back and find that.
Yes, memorization was a great device in the public schools in her day and my day, and I still remember some of those poems.
What were some of the ones that you had to memorize?
Oh, on the shores of Gitche Gumee stood the wigwam of Nokomis. Invictus, of course. When I was starting to think that I might actually have a life outside of what my parents had prescribed, I would constantly recite Invictus. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Should have known then what it was going to lead to.
Do you know how she felt about music or musicians?
You know, I think she liked music, but all that I have to base that on is, of course, the video about her, and of course she talks in her poetry. She does allude to gospel hymns a lot because she is from an evangelical background or a charismatic. Even though she later converted and became a Catholic, her family in Oklahoma was obviously from the Sandhill gospel stuff.
That sort of brings up her spirituality, her own spirituality, and the journey that she had, which I think is very obvious in her work too. What could you say about her feelings about Oklahoma?
Oh, I think she had a great affection for Oklahoma, although I can't remember whether she said this outright or whether it was inferred in her writing, is that she knew she would never live here again, and that she was definitely a Californian. She had adapted, and she had found a world there that incorporated the Oklahoma world and the greater world, and so that she, even though she led a rather closed-in life in one sense, she was welcoming to diversity, because she talked about the Portuguese, the Portuguese people, and she spoke with affection about the different cultures and races and ethnic groups that she had contact with. I think she had a really big heart, and she was socially, politically at least, she was a liberal. Now she may have been a conservative in some ways, but she was definitely very liberal and she liked reaching out to different people. And she wrote about different people, and she wrote affectionately and insightfully.
We've talked a little, I think, about her personal values. Do you have anything else you want to say about that?
Oh, I think she was honest to a fault, if you can be that honest. I think she had a great. I think she had a lot of principles, and she stuck by them come hell or high water. I mean, she obviously was very, very devoted to her mother, to her, and looked after her until the day she died, and she grieved greatly for her mother. I mean, it showed in her poetry and the things she said, her comments. She loved her father a lot. She wrote of him. I love the poems about her father, especially that one called A Prince Albert Wind. That is just so moving. So I think she was a highly principled person, and whatever her feelings about her position in the world or how the world viewed her, she certainly didn't compromise. She never compromised her principles. She never compromised her principles, even though she felt defensive about her work, and I can relate to that so much. You know, even though I have a fairly secure position in my community, primarily because of my profession, because a lawyer and a judge in a small rural community is there's some weight there. And so I never had to be defensive about any of that. But as far as my poetry, that is so personal that it's very difficult to shove it out there where it's naked and people are looking at it. And so I can imagine how it must have been for her. And she resisted publication for a long time and said, I am writing for myself. Mm-hmm. Nobody writes for themselves. I mean, I firmly believe that no matter if you think you are and you think I'll never show this to anybody, there comes a time when you want to say, look at this. This is what I'm saying. Because without two people, language, we don't need language unless you're going to say something to another person. So if you use language, you want somebody to hear it. You want somebody. And she finally, I think at long last, after many years of writing down her words, she agreed to let them go out into the world. And I read just in one of the clippings in here, I think Gerald Haslam wrote about it, and you'll find it in some of these things. The very first time she published, she was so afraid that people wouldn't buy it that she canvassed ahead of time and took subscriptions. And I think she said she got 200 subscriptions of people that said they would buy the book if it was published, and only then did she agree to publish it. And they actually printed 500 copies of the book, and that turned out not to be enough.
Wow.
So she had the same misgivings about publishing and about exposing her innermost life, and that's what you do in poetry. You tell what's really down inside there. So it's like, letting people see your underwear or something. So.
Well, what is it like to be a poet trying to get published?
Well, as I've said before, it's like shoving your newborn children out the door, or maybe not so newborn, but you still feel like they might not be able to fend for themselves if you just shoved them out into the world. And it is, it's your ego. Your ego is involved as well as your innermost feelings and thoughts. And so it's very hard. I resisted sending my poems to anybody else. That's why I did my own book. I thought, well, I'll do this, and then if nobody else is taking the risk, and I didn't feel like asking someone to take the risk. Mm-hmm. And so I published my own work for a long time before I ever sent it to anybody else. And people had to start asking me for it. So is there a little resemblance between me and Wilma Elizabeth? Yes, because I wasn't ready for someone else to judge my work.
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Did you want to hang on to that, the ownership of it too? Was that
that was also part of it.
Mm-hmm.
That was also part of it because these are mine.
Mm-hmm.
This is mine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to share a lot of things with people, but you're really, things that really involve your inner core are very hard, I think, too. And I think that's true of every poet, whether they're just throwing them to the winds or what. There's still something inside you that says, oh God, please, 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 you know.
Do you find it common that poets then use the small presses, and your perspective of doing your own writing and having your own press, is that common for small presses?
I think a lot of small presses began that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't, I haven't canvassed everybody, but I think a lot of them began that way. And then there's a feeling once you see that people like it and that it speaks to somebody, and it doesn't matter to me, there's a lot of people that don't care for my poetry, and I know there are some people that buy the poetry book just because other people are buying it or because it's the thing to do. But if there's one person that comes to you out of 50 or 100 and says, my God, these are my innermost thoughts, you've said what I wanted to say, then you're on top of the world till you get another book done. Mm-hmm. So yes, it is, and poetry is different in the sense that it is not a how-to book, which right now are the highest sellers there are, the nonfiction, instructive kind of thing. So the big publishers, they don't care; they're not interested in poetry. And I will say this: I read not long ago that unless you're somebody like Billy Collins or Robert Penske or somebody like that, 1,000 book sale of a poetry book is considered excellent. Mm. And so I think that small presses in Oklahoma, I think My Little Press and Janetta Mish's press in Norman, I think we do an okay job because we sell that many, or close to that many. I mean, and several hundred, like, Al Turner. Al Turner's book, he's sold between 300 and 500. I'd have to look at the books to find out. And I also, I'm pleased to say that 3 of the 5 finalists in the Oklahoma Book Award this year were published by Village Books Press. And so I think small presses are better for poetry, especially regional poetry. Mm-hmm. And I'm very, very interested in regional poetry and people, because there's a lot of Wilma Elizabeths out there. Mm-hmm. And if nobody publishes them and nobody reads them, we all lose. And I'm just not going to let that happen if I can help it.
How important is it for a writer or a poet to be able to market, which that probably isn't the greatest term to use. I mean, some circles that maybe has a bit of a negative connotation, but to be able to try to help sell their work? Well,
you do have to market and you do have to say the word. And if you're going to be a publisher, you have to say that word. And yes, you're right. Some people call that a dirty word. They say, but this is art. Well, still, art takes paper and ink and machines and work, somebody's time and effort. And the only person that can actually market poetry is the poet, especially unless you're, like I said, the Billy Collins of this world who's built up a reputation, and just the mention of your name, people run out and buy your book. Whether they read them or not, I don't know. But a poet has to develop a following. They have to I like to say they have to make a literary life for themselves, because it's the very nature of poetry, because you're talking about something very intimate. Poetry is an intimate literature, really, and even more intimate than books that are supposed to be about intimacy, because it is terribly intimate. And the only person that can sell poetry is the poet. And that's why I tell people when they talk about getting their book published, I say, well, what kind of a following have you developed? Have you connected with enough people with your poetry? You've got to connect with people. You have got to put people in the eye and tell them your poems and see if anything connects. And that's the only reason that people like poetry, is you can connect with them. So, and you can't do that sitting at home and letting someone print your books and lay them on a shelf someplace. You can't take them down to Full Circle and set them up there if no one's ever heard of you or heard you read or know what you're saying, because there's too many choices. If they're just going to go in the bookstore, they'll buy Robert Penske, or they'll buy Billy Collins, or they'll buy Maxine Kumin. And they won't buy Dorothy Alexander if Dorothy Alexander hasn't been down there reading and building a literary life. Mm-hmm. I didn't start building a literary life till I was 65 years old, but it is the funnest thing I've done in my life.
Do you think that's why Wilma sent her books out like she did so many places?
Wilma was making a literary life. She may not have called it that. I'm sure she didn't. But Wilma at some point began making a literary life, and she did like it, whether she says she didn't or not. Even when she complains about the academic coming to her house and making kind of light and making little funny derisive poems about them, she liked it. Mm-hmm. It was her literary life, and it was her dream, I can tell you, without her telling me. I know how these things go, and it is your life. It becomes your life, and when it happens, it is so fulfilling. Even in the poems where she complains about having to go to these places where they're serving tea and people are making small talk, she did go. Mm-hmm.
That says something.
Yes, if it was so painful, she would have stayed home.
She tried it anyway.
Yeah. I say no matter how painful the reading or how painful the event you have to go to, just think about it as material for the next poem. See, I'm doing research.
Oh. Okay, this is a good pausing point here. I'm going to change the tape out. Okay, well, this is tape 2 of our recording. Today's May 20th, 2009. Here with Dorothy Alexander and interviewing her for the Remembering Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel, poet and Oklahoma Dust Bowl immigrant, oral history project of the OSU Library. I'd like to know a little bit about your press. I'm not really familiar with publishing or anything, but so do you have your own equipment where you print things yourself, or how does that work?
I do have printing equipment and also binding. Mm-hmm. I can make the perfect bound books. So I have a little machine that I heard about on NPR and called a Powys Parker. And it was developed by a fellow named Powys Parker, who was kind of an eccentric teenager and tinkered with spare parts of old printers for, his mother said, for 20 years. Of course, he couldn't have been a teenager for 20 years, but eventually he did perfect this machine, and it's used primarily by small schools to make their yearbooks, because the yearbook companies like Jostens, who I had print this book of mine. Mm-hmm. I didn't do it the hardback. I could do hardbacks, but it would be very difficult. But Jostens in Topeka, Kansas, printed and bound this one for me. All the others I've done in my own little shop. But this machine that they have will do books. It's a little bit labor intensive, but you take 17 seconds for each book. You have to handle each book separately many times and print the covers and then glue the covers on. But it makes them doable as far as the economics are concerned. Of course, the printer companies are making it harder all the time. I figured out ways to refill cartridges so that I didn't have to buy a cartridge all the time. Otherwise, it's totally not doable. And they're about to close all of the loopholes on on the little office printers, so I may have to go to and I've already spoken to a fellow about a commercial size printer, or with the economic downturn of the last few months, the commercial printers are getting a lot easier to deal with too, and they actively seek business. So I'm in the process right now of negotiating with some and looking at my options, because I have 9 books in the pipeline now to publish. There are many worthy poets in Oklahoma, and there's a lot of literary stuff going on. Poetry is on the upswing in Oklahoma, has been for the last few years. There are some very exciting literary events aimed at poetry. There's the Red Dirt Book Festival in Shawnee, although it's not altogether poetry, but it is a big boost for poetry writers, poets, and especially the festival they hold at East Central at Ada called the Scissor Tail, that's held every year the first week in April. And there's many readings, poetry readings. I think we counted up the other day, there's something like 30 poetry readings a week in Oklahoma City in public places. And they have one every week at Galileo's on the Paseo, and then there's at the bookstores and various places. So there's a lot of interest in poetry right now, and there's enough, and some of the poets are very good because you get the more practice you get reading your poetry in the public, the better poet you become, and the more you're known, your work is known, and the market will kind of sift out the wannabes from the real thing, so that I can truthfully say I have never lost money. Sometimes I just break even. And on some I actually make enough to buy a new machine or something. So it's not a get rich thing, certainly not. But it does, as long as it's a hobby, and in one sense it's an avocation, I guess I should say. But it does pay for itself, which is more than a lot of people can say for their avocation, you know. So it does. I am able to keep buying the machines and buying the ink and buying the paper. And besides that, it is so much fun. It is so much fun. It is, it's very rewarding. And, you know, you look at what Wilma did. Most of her stuff was I don't even know that you could call this press. I mean, some of them she just wrote out herself, and they're in her handwriting. They weren't even typed. They were folded over and stapled and distributed. So that's home cooking. That is home cooking, and there's nothing wrong with it. So however you get it out there is the point is to get it out there, and small presses can do that in Oklahoma. I'm really pleased to be a part of that. And we have a tradition of that in Oklahoma. Just a couple of weeks ago, my press put on an event in Norman to honor and give tribute to the old Point Writers Press. It was one of the original small poetry presses in Oklahoma, and it was started by Frank Parman and Arn Henderson, who were architectural students in the School of Architecture at OU, but they were followers of Bruce Goff. So, you know, Bruce was very much the artist in those days at OU in the 60s, 50s, late 50s and 60s. And Frank and Arn are still around, but they're old fellows now, especially Frank. But the books they published, they published Wilma Elizabeth.
Oh.
Yeah, I should have brought that anthology. They didn't publish a separate book of hers, but they published her in the Point Writers Anthology. And I don't know how they found out about her. I need to ask Frank that. But they have some of her poems in there from way back. And they have some of Ted Kooser. Way back there, some of these guys, these people that were unknowns, they found their way to Oklahoma and Frank's little press, and they were published. So, and Frank's the one that started the Individual Artists of Oklahoma. It was called Contemporary Arts at the time. It actually started in Norman. among the architectural students. The tribute, the celebration a couple of weeks ago, if you ever want to see a reunion of hippies, there were like 90 people there.
Oh, wow.
We had it at the depot, the little performing arts studio that they have in the old depot, Norman Depot. And so it was just filled with aging hippies.
Well, but that's fun. How did you get the word out about it?
Actually, Frank's wife, Sarah Island, and Arn Henderson, who's still somewhat active. I think he's an adjunct professor now, part-time at the. They managed to find these people. We planned it for 3 months, and I asked them to get the addresses and stuff. So we found a lot of email addresses and then just word of mouth. But I mean, people came out of the woodwork. It was a very interesting event.
Talk about the difference between reading poetry and hearing poetry.
Well, we talk about in the poetry community, we talk about some people are good on the page and some are good on the stage and some are good both places. And I'll give you, for instance, Billy Collins' poetry. I love Billy Collins' poetry. I don't know if you're familiar with Billy Collins. He was poet laureate a few years ago. He's a very high-selling, his books sell, in the thousands and thousands. And it's great poetry. It's down-to-earth poetry. And he came to Oklahoma to read. I don't know whether you're aware of the program at OCU that Jeannie Hoffman Smith Foundation funds, and they bring it the Famous Poet series, and they bring a really famous poet. They pay them, I'm sure, a lot of money. And every year in April, they bring someone. And Billy Collins came I think it's been about 3 or 4 years ago. And he turned out to be the rudest man I've ever heard. He was very rude to the people. There was a question and answer session at this workshop. He was very rude. So the man who was reading the poetry was not the same man that was talking to people. And so, of course, I had to hark back to my own thing about William Butler Yeats. But at that time, it was really emphasized that some poets are better on the page than on the stage. So if he doesn't make any comments, if he just reads the poetry, he might be all right. There is a difference. Now, some people write poetry, what we call the experimental poets, that write poetry that even looks good on the page. I mean, it's shaped poetry. And that's a whole different thing. You can't read the shape. I am not a great fan of that kind of poetry. I don't mind reading it, and I think there's a lot of people that like it. I am more of a spoken word kind of person because I come from an oral tradition, and so that my loyalty or my affection lies with that kind of poetry. But I think to really put your poem across, if you want to really speak to people through your poetry, you have to learn to read poetry. You have to be able to project your message. It's like anything else. It takes selling, and so, marketing may be a dirty word, but it's the truth. You do have to sell. It's like preachers do it. I mean, if you're dealing in ideas, which is what we are, you're dealing in ideas, then you must project your ideas. You must sell them to other people. And I hear a lot of good poets. I have a friend, and I've published a book for her. She's a farmer in western Oklahoma, and she writes, I think, spectacular poetry. But she reads in a monotone. And I have said to her many times, your poetry is too good for your reading. You've got to do your justice to your poetry. And I think that's a special talent. And I think that poets need to work on that part of it as well as the composing. Because your words... Wilma Elizabeth had her own style. It's not my style.
Mm-hmm.
But she had a style, and it worked for her. It worked for her. But her poetry was strong on the page.
Mm-hmm.
It was very strong on the page. And I love reading her poetry. I read her poetry at poetry readings a lot.
Do you, okay, and when you read it silently, are you hearing it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think somewhere I have a poem about whose voice do you hear in your head when you read? Because you do hear a voice,
Mm-hmm.
whether you've ever acknowledged it or not. You do hear a voice, and I can hear her voice.
Mm-hmm.
I could hear her voice before I ever heard her. I could hear her voice.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a lot because I've heard it from other people too, because I am attuned to her cultural background.
Do you remember the letter that I read at the program that she wrote in 1984 about if they were going to do a program for her?
It might be nice to have pie. Yeah. I love that letter.
Yeah, I did too.
It's poetry. It's poetry itself.
It had to be part of the program, and we had to try to tie in things like the shamrocks with the program.
And so when I had Frank's thing, I told Deb, she said, what kind of food? Well, I need to call the caterer. We need to get something going. And I said, might be nice to have pie. And she said, I'm not going to have pie for people. I can't make pie for people. I don't know how many are coming.
Oh, but when you're the poet, you can set the...
Yeah, right.
You can make all kinds of requests about going to
That's
one
right.
of your programs. Everything from the... saluting the American flag,
exactly.
And prayer and Bible reading, and
right.
Yeah.
Then it might be nice to have pie. I love that line.
How has her poetry and prose influenced you? You've already touched on this, but I think I want to bring it out again. How's her poetry and prose influenced you?
Well, obviously, it has influenced me greatly. I write very few poems that I don't think of her. I mean, I'm almost going to get me a bracelet that says, "What would Wilma do?" Because when I have doubts about a poem, when I work on a poem, and my poems just kind of come out of the blue. I mean, I hear a word or a phrase, or I see something, and it just says to me, this is poetry. This is poetry. And so then my job is to get it down, is to get the right words in the right order. And if I have trouble doing that, I go and I pick up one of these little books. I have them handy, and I just pick one of them up, and I go through here, and I read a few, and I say, okay, now I know. Because there's very few of her poems that don't work. Mm-hmm. There's occasionally, there's a poem that doesn't work for me, but very few of them that don't work. So when I'm having trouble making one of my poems work, I go and look at her. So yes, her influence well, I just wouldn't be a poet. It'd be really hard for me to be a poet without having known her work, because it pushed me over the edge, and
and continues.
It continues to hold me there. Mm-hmm. I hang on to her poems with my fingertips, over the edge of the known world. Mm-hmm. I am suspended by Wilma Elizabeth's poetry. Yes, the influence is unmistakable. And I hope that, I really hope that when people read my poetry, they can find the ones that are influenced by her.
Oh, I can see it.
I think that to me, it's I know where they came from.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I have found interesting about her, and maybe it isn't such an unusual thing, but I've wondered about it, and I would like to ask you about that, and that is how I've seen different versions of her poems in print. One in particular is her litany poem, where she mentions Oklahoma town names, and I've actually seen 3 different versions of that. Would you talk about that for a minute?
Well, every poet I've ever known personally wants to revise their poems after they see them in print. They say, oh, darn, why did I say that? I should have said so-and-so. But there's kind of an unwritten rule that once they're published, you leave them alone, unless you bring out new and selected. And even then, some publishers, some of the stick-in-the-mud publishers say you can't do that. I won't publish. I won't include one that you've changed. But sometimes people do. In fact, I have been guilty of it myself. But then, she told me I could. But she did it all the time. And really, she made her own rules, and you can do that. You can do that. And she wasn't doing anything to please publishers. So there you go. So I think you can do whatever you damn well please, and she did, and she did. And I look at some of mine, and like I said, I have redone a few of mine, because the poems in this book, the art that has the art in it, it's a lot of those poems came from some of my other books, and I did tweak them here and there. But that's a great temptation, and she reworked hers a lot. Now the poems she sent me for the broomweed, she said, here's some that I haven't sent to anybody else. But I think she lost track of them, because I have seen them. I have seen one of these, I know, but it was under a different title.
Would you like to read it?
Yes, this one's called Oklahoma March. The mean wind blew 3 weeks straight that spring. So hard I had to put my poems under a sad iron to keep my thoughts from blowing all over Texas. I was ashamed to let people know I thought Brother Fuller's sermons were duds, and I wrote that on scrap paper, also a poem about his wife who thought she was a belle, which was a laugh to me even when she taught my Sunday school class. I had to be careful and not bust out and shame my mother. I have seen that one before, but it was under a different title. This one I haven't seen anywhere else, but it doesn't mean that it's not there, because I think in spite of all of my digging, I've missed some of her stuff. It's called Maybe One of the Last, and maybe you'll recognize it. Ezra Potts is even older than I am, but in much better condition. No glasses, most of his own teeth, back straight as a board, walks everywhere, champion at checkers, very composed for the most part, even adjusting to the death of his wife. She went off to heaven where she always wanted to go. I can't fault her for that. Me, I'd rather just linger here in this vale of tears as long as I can, maybe be one of the very last Okies to hit California from the dust of 1935. Now, I haven't read that one that I recall anywhere else.
I don't recognize it.
But I do see, and she also, I have found where she put two together. She took parts out of one, parts out of another, and so I have to confess that I do that occasionally myself. Because some magazines, some periodicals, they will say, this month we're taking poems about such and such. And every poem is really about more than one thing. It could be more than one thing. That's the nature of poetry. So when I have one that I think fits, that says something to whatever they're talking about, I will get it, and I will tweak it just a little bit and put something in there that will catch their eye. But that's the name of the game. The University of Oklahoma Medical School has they publish a book called, a literary and art book called Blood and Thunder. It comes out once a year, and they solicit submissions. And it has to be about medical care or something to do with caregiving and medical treatment, that sort of thing, because they use it as a tool to teach their interns, their medical students, to make them more human or whatever. And so they're introducing the arts to them. And so I take poems that haven't been published anywhere else, poems that I wrote maybe for some place that's been turned down, or that I haven't found a home for, and I do those. I've read them in public, but I tweak those a little bit to fit what they're asking for, and then I send them in. So they're mine until somebody publishes them. But I think if you're going to publish in a lot of magazines or other people's things, which she didn't do a lot, that once they've been published, that you need to leave them alone and not twist them enough that you can use them again. I think that to me, my own rule is that you shouldn't retread them to work in a lot of different places. But if somebody's been kind enough to take them and publish them, especially, of course, it's against the rules if they buy them from you, which Oklahoma Today buys poems. So it seems funny. I've got to write a poem about selling out, I think. I may sell out the business. I'll sell all my poems.
So you're contracted to do that with them?
So, anyway, when you sell them a poem, you sign all kinds of papers, and it's hardly worth the $40 they pay you.
I sense some irony here. Do you have any other poems of hers that you brought that you would like to read?
Well, here's one I like, and I read this one at poetry readings because it is about a poet, and I think it tells my story to a certain degree. One day in a California vineyard, 1936, that's the title. We were all there picking grapes among the sticky August vines, black widows, divorcees, yellow jackets, yellow bellies, one suspected poet, and a man wearing the pants of his wedding suit. There was a cotton-haired boy who sat under the vines and played Red River Valley on his harmonica over and over. This started one divorcee to sobbing and wishing she had her old man back. The Yellow Belly remembered two people he could have saved, but admitted to himself he was a coward. At noon, the suspected poet took a pencil stub from her pocket and wrote words on her brown paper lunch bag. So, yeah. And that's I like that one because I do that a lot. And I love funerals. My God, country funerals. There's just so many poems there. And I have to hide a little piece of paper. Sometimes, that little thing they give you with the obituary on it. I have a pencil and I surreptitiously write notes on my little program, trying not to be irreverent. But there's a lot of material there. And there's another one of hers that I wanted to read where it says, I am not Circe, but I can't find it. I had it the other day and I thought I marked it. But it's not coming to me now. It's about a little Okie girl who puts on airs and pretends to be Circe, but finally admits she is not Circe, the temptress. So you see, she was well read. She knew about the Greek gods. She knew, and that I call it. Sometimes I do it. I call it my cornpone face, my cornpone stance. Depends on who I'm reading to. I can't. I thought I marked it, but I guess I didn't. And like I said, the poem about her father. She was very, very fond of her father. It was obvious. The one about the Prince Albert Wind. I think even one of her books is called Prince Albert Wind. My father smoked Prince Albert too when I was a little girl.
My uncle used Prince Albert, and I remember his tobacco cans.
Yeah.
He was a farmer. How do you think that her poetry, looking ahead, her poetry is somewhat specific to regions, to particular time periods. So, how do you think on down the road the influence is going to be?
I think it's lasting because I think all poetry is regional. I think all poetry is regional. Poets write about what they know, but it can also be universal, and hers has that characteristic. And there is the universal is contained within the local. I mean, that's just what it is. That's the vehicle it rides in. And so, yes, it will last. It will last. I told my friend coming over here today, she said, "Are you going to wear that hat?" And I said, "Yes, I am going to wear that hat for my interview." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Because they're making a video of this, and this video will last a long time, and it will be one of the few marks I leave on the world, and I wanted to accurately reflect what I was about." And she said, "How long do you think it will last?" And I said, "Well, as long as there are people, this video will last as long as there's people at the university and so forth." Of course, we've been watching that film that's called The World Without People. Have you seen that on the History Channel?
No.
Oh, it's telling what happens to the world when people go away. But we won't get to that. But that's how long Wilma Elizabeth's poetry will be relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If it was going to go away, it would have gone away when the Dust Bowl went away. But it's only gathering strength. She's just now really being discovered, and it's sad because but this is the case in lots of the great ones. They weren't discovered till they were gone.
What do you think people in Oklahoma should know about her?
Well, I think they should acknowledge that she's one of their own. I think they should know that. I think they should know her work as I know it, and as Mrs. Mayles, as Lorena Mayles out in Cheyenne, Oklahoma, knew it, and not because of the reflected glory, although that's part of it, to have one of your own garner attention. But because it validates a way of life. It validates your own value system, your own niche in history, your culture. It validates everything that we're about. It gives credibility. It says it matters. It says just because you were poor and lived on a dirt farm does not mean you weren't real, that you didn't matter, because you do matter. And I think that's what they need to know, is that it is a validation. It is a validation of everything that that Oklahoma stands for, because this state was made up of a bunch of misfits. I mean, people didn't come out here because things were going well at home. You know? If things are going really well at home, you didn't pick up and move out to a dusty place. So, you know, it's okay. And I think that will be her legacy. I hope so.
Mm-hmm. We mentioned migration at lunchtime. I'm not sure that we covered everything that you might have wanted to say about that in the interview. Do you know? Does anything come to your mind about migration?
Well, I think she pretty much personifies the heart of the migrant, the soul of the migrant. If nothing else, which of course she was a lot more than that. She does signify a lot more than that. But certainly the essence of being a migrant. And migration is is many things. It can be a sad thing, it can be a sorrowful thing, it can also be a joyful thing. And she was able to capture the range of what migration means. The sadness of leaving a place, the sadness of people who saw those go that went, and the new life. I mean, she didn't mourn. She didn't mourn. She looked back and saw great joy in what she had learned in Oklahoma. I mean, she chronicled the sadness, but she didn't epitomize it. But she also talked about what they found in the new land. You know, Canaan wasn't all that bad, and which, you know, in my book, I look at it from the other end, and I like to see the humor in it, although it was a sad thing. I remember it as a sad thing. I was a very small child, and of course what I saw was that people were leaving, and it was very sad. Here's one I wrote. In fact, my father decided we would go to California, and he packed us all up, and we went by my grandparents' house to say goodbye, and my grandfather said, "Get off the truck and get things unpacked and get on back home." I mean, and Dad said, "Well, I'm afraid I can't make my farm payments, my mortgage payments." And he said, we'll make the payments. Your mother and I have money saved." But here's one called "The Lucky Ones." Me and Brother cried when the cousins went off to California in 1939 in Uncle Lonnie Rosenbaum's old Plymouth sedan. Mattresses tied down with clothesline, Aunt Pet holding the canary cage on her lap. "It's not fair," Brother said, "to have to stay here while they have all the fun in California. Why, even that dang bird's luckier than us." But and then here's my grandmother. My grandparents took the position that the people that went were quitters. That they were kind of because if you were really strong, you would have hung on. Mm-hmm. But of course that's because they had money in the bank. But here's the one about the same family, the Rosenbaums, our cousins. It's called "Vacation in Oklahoma." "We couldn't tell what was coming the year Uncle Lonnie took his family off to California to pick prunes and stayed forever. We missed the kids, especially baby Shirley, until she came back in the summer of 1948 to visit us. Long tanned legs, lipstick, eyeshadow, strapped sandals. She had it all at 14. Poured into postage stamp shorts, smoking Pall Malls, flicking a Zippo like a pro. She had the country boys breathing through their mouths like fish, and Joe Bob Gresham developed a stutter. It had Grandma wondering out loud, what on earth are they thinking about out there in Bakersfield?" But it taught me her poetry, and that one, by the way, is also patterned on hers. It caused me to look at what happened through new eyes, that there was humor in it. There was, it was not something that we all died over. You know, we didn't all die of it. The ones that stayed home, we didn't die. We might have wanted to go, or we might have been sad that they went. And the ones that went, they didn't die over it. You know, they got on in a new place, and then they came back and told us about California and what she has, the ones about the lemons. Let's think of me, an Okie with a lemon, my own lemon tree. Mm-hmm. And I can remember us saying, "Oh my God, somebody went to California, and so and them, and they picked avocados right off a tree in their yard." And everybody said, "No, that you mean it?" You know, so it was. It wasn't the sad thing. It was sad in some ways, but there was also the other side to it. Mm-hmm. So she showed us all facets, mm-hmm. and that's why it is a lasting thing, I think.
And why it endures.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a great interview. I do want to ask you about this book, though. If you'll hold you have a copy there.
I do.
Hold that up. This book that you have, it has this combination of your poetry and your art. in it, and it's a lovely, lovely book. I love this combination, and I just kind of wondered if you talk about that a little bit. And was this the first one that you did like this?
Yes, this was a great idea, and it was a lot of fun. It was the idea of Cynthia Wolfe, who is the owner of Adelante Gallery down on the Paseo, the art district in Oklahoma City. And she had this idea to enlist women artists to respond to my poetry. There's a kind of poetry that responds to art that's fairly common. It's called ekphrastic poetry, Ekpharstic. And a lot of people do it. A lot of famous poets. Auden wrote that very famous poem about who was the guy that tried to fly to the sun on wax wings, and you know who I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And he fell, and there's a famous painting of that. And he wrote a poem about it. That's called ekphrastic poetry. She said, why don't we do the opposite? Why don't we do one where you give your poems to artists and have them respond with visual art? And so we did. We sent out a request for proposals, and people sent artists, women artists. We specified Oklahoma women artists. Mm-hmm. And so they did. They sent, and we picked out 20, counting, and I put some art in. That counts me and my friend Debbie. And it has photographs and sculpture and paintings and even needlework. And so the 20 people submitted art, and we photographed the art and included them with the poetry. And the artists had they had a great time doing it, and I certainly did. It made all the difference. It made my poems come alive. And then we had this wonderful exhibit down at the Adelante Gallery. And when the exhibit opened, it ran through last November. When I walked in, and the entire gallery was full of these paintings, the walls, they were all there. It was like my life passing before my eyes. It was so much fun. We all had a great deal of fun, the artists, and so we're just waiting for this to kind of die down so we can do it again. Oh. But it has everything in here. I love the one, especially a friend of mine did a quilt from my son who passed away some years ago. I saved all his shirts, and I was going to make a quilt, but I could never bring myself to do it because when I got the shirts out, I was overcome with sadness. So a dear friend of mine who now lives in Arizona, she used to live in western Oklahoma, she took the shirts and she made this wonderful quilt. And there's a photograph of it on page 57, and it went with the poem called The Photograph that is for my son Kim. Of my son Kim, and the poem was dedicated. But it was a wonderful project, and I did the cover. Mm-hmm. I included my sister's picture when she was a little girl because she had a sweeter face than I did. Mm-hmm. I was kind of scowled when I was a little girl. On the photograph on the back of the cover, the little girl in the front row, third from the left side, mm-hmm. is me, and you see the scowl on my face. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't use my face. So mm-hmm. when we looked a lot alike, if I'd smiled more.
So did you select poems knowing that this was going to be incorporate the art in this book?
Yes, and I selected things that kind of followed a theme. I went through all my poetry books and also some new poems, of course. Mm-hmm. And I did set them out sort of in a chronological order of growing up, growing old in Oklahoma, and the losses that are necessary losses. But I love the response. It really brought the poetry. It made me think about my poetry. I mean, I saw things in my poetry I hadn't seen before, and that's always nice to find that there's things there that even surprise yourself.
So when the request went out and the artists were putting their pieces together to go with this, did you see them before they were on display at the gallery?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I selected.
So were
I
they
selected
sending
the
them
ones.
to you?
Yes, they brought them. They sent photographs, and they sent. Well, they sent a written description of what they intended to do, which poems, because we didn't want everybody to choose the same poem. And I sent a packet. Yes, I sent a packet of 65 poems to each artist that we had selected to participate.
Mm-hmm.
And so they went through the poems, and they could select from 1 to 4 each. Some people just selected 1, some 2, some 3, and I think 2 or 3 people went so far as to do 4 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I selected the ones that would go in the book. Cynthia selected the ones that would be in the exhibit. And so everybody had at least one in the book and at least one in the exhibit. And it was quite well attended. And then I gave poetry readings. On opening night, when the exhibit opened, the show opened, I read. We actually rented the gallery next door where we could have more room, and there were like 100 people.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
I gave 3 different readings that night because we only had 35 chairs. But yeah, it was a very fun thing, and the book has sold really, really well.
Well, it's a great book. And so, do the artists keep their pieces then that are in the book?
They they were for sale, and so actually most of them sold, and I bought quite a few of them. And then there's a few that haven't sold yet. But when I go around to libraries and communities around in rural Oklahoma and read, I take those with me because people like to see the original art. And so it's a really fun thing, and I have a lot of fun out in the countryside because the poems, especially women my age, really. They really relate.
When you mentioned that you go to, and I know we're getting off track, but your story is another story in itself, and it's all together.
I hope.
To me, and I'm not sure if I would have the opportunity to interview you again to talk about, your work and everything too, but when you mentioned going out to the libraries in rural Oklahoma and that kind of thing, I'm curious about how that works for you. I know there's a network of poets in Oklahoma and that you all keep in touch and you have the listserv, as a way to keep in touch with who's reading where and that kind of thing. But what is this process like for you, as far as getting your work out there or offering to come and do readings and tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, it's part of my plan for making a literary life.
Yes, that's what I want to know about.
I have a little in the business called a media packet. And the Daily Oklahoman reviewed this show 3 different times. They reviewed it from the literary end, and they reviewed it from the art end. And then it was also reviewed in connection with my work with Jim Chastain, which I don't know if you know about Jim. He's a terminally ill poet from Norman. And the channel, whatever channel is connected with the Daily Oklahoman, is doing a blog and a series of his last days. He's terminally ill. But at any rate, there's a media packet because there was a lot of color photos of the art. So I put together all of that, and then I pick out small libraries and I send them a book because I had many of these printed. The more you have printed, the cheaper they get. But at any rate, I intended to make this a long-term project because I thought it merited that. So I send a free book and I send my little packet to the libraries, and I say, here's a gift for you, and I would also offer my services to present a program. I would do a reading, a review, or even a little workshop, because I also do workshops in family histories and telling family stories through poems and prose. And so the libraries, then I send all of these out, and I don't send out to all the state at one time. I pick sections, and because I don't want to get too many, because most people respond. And so I say, here are the dates that are open, or within the next month or so if you want it out sooner than that. And then the librarians seem glad to get people. So I read at places like Altus and Mangum and Hollis and Shattuck and Arnett and Woodward and Miami and Fairview and Ponca City and Shawnee and places like that. So it's a great fun thing, and it's a great way to live your life. I think it's a fun way to do it.
Well, that's great. That's interesting to find out how that works.
And of course it's mostly women that respond, but not all. There are men. There are a lot of men. At Altus, I think there was probably 20, 25 men came to that reading. So
that's great. That's good to know about.
But it's all, I have to give credit to Wilma Elizabeth.
Yes.
Because if I hadn't figured out how to do that, wouldn't have happened. And I always read one of hers. I almost always
do. Different ones.
Yeah. I always talk about Wilma Elizabeth, and I say, I didn't invent this kind of poetry. I'll tell you who invented it. And this is mine. Because I usually start out with a little reading from my original book.
Do you find that people still are very interested in the Dust Bowl days and they respond to that? Yes,
especially out west. Because that's where really the Dust Bowl was.
Right.
I know that a lot of people put it in eastern Oklahoma, but the Depression was there, and it was the Depression as much as the dust that sent people fleeing this place. So
I think eastern Oklahoma still hasn't recovered from the fact that Steinbeck starts his book in eastern Oklahoma.
I know, in Sallisaw.
They're still mad about that.
Yeah, I know. The other Oklahoma writer, Oklahoma author that has not gotten her due is Sonora Babb. I don't know whether you know about her or not, but her book is really better than Steinbeck's, if you want to know the truth.
Yeah, Alvin was here this spring for a program over his book, Letters from the Dust Bowl.
Yes.
Caroline's book.
Right.
Which I've been meaning to go up there and see where their place was.
Yeah.
Have you ever done that? You have?
Yeah. Yeah, I've gone there, and then I go to the Sonora Babb family reunions they have up in Waynoka, because they always ask me to come and read poetry there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so that's very interesting, and I correspond with Doug Wexler, her biographer, and who's at the University of Texas, at the library there.
Okay, well.
So Wilma Elizabeth opened a whole new life for me. She began my literary life. She not only made her life, but she helped me make mine.
That's a wonderful legacy for her, and then for you too. Well, thank you very much for the interview today. It's been quite enlightening. Learned a lot. I'm glad that we had your stories to be able to not only preserve her legacy, but also yours as well. This has been a real pleasure and a real treat.
Thank you. It's a privilege, really, for me to be able to do this. And I never dreamed in my wildest dreams that I would have this opportunity to give my side of the story as far as Wilma Elizabeth. And so thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. And I appreciated that you came to the program that we had at Chandler when we did the week of the programs too. That was really nice that you.
That was a wonderful experience. Wonderful experience. So.